Hello, and welcome to the October 2025 meeting of Triangle Association of Freelancers. Our guest this evening is Moriah Richard, Managing Editor with Writer's Digest. This evening, Moriah is going to be talking with us about conquering your doubt demons. Moriah, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really
Moriah, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
There we go. Before you talk about doubt demons, tell us very, very briefly a little bit about your professional background.
Sure. So I got my bachelor's in writing and English literature. I moved directly into getting my MFA in fiction writing. It was while I was in my MFA program that I really started to look into editorial as a career path for myself. I was the editor-in-chief of Tinge Literary Magazine, an editorial intern for Touchpoint Press. I became an editorial administrator for the American Pharmacists Association, where I handled purely academic pharmaceutical texts, which was a departure from what I had been doing. Then I worked as a managing editor and a book coach for a very, very small indie press that specialized in self-help nonfiction. And I went from doing that kind of work into my role at Writer's Digest. I was hired in 2020 at WD, first as an editor and then promoted to managing editor a year later. And in my work there, some of the things that I love doing besides writing for and editing the magazine and creating content for our blog is I spearhead the Flash Fiction February Challenge, where every day in February I will post a flash fiction prompt along with a totally raw, unedited flash piece of my own based on that prompt to encourage others to share their work in whatever form it takes. And I also have created and write the Building Better Worlds world building column, which was a 2023 Eddie Award winner. So I'm very happy to be here and to speak with you all about something that I know intimately, which is doubt demons and imposter syndrome.
It's all yours.
All right, sounds good. So, the way that my brain works is that I will kind of run through this presentation for you guys. I ask that you hold off on submitting any questions or raising your hand or anything until the end, just so that I don't get off track and keep you here for the next 7 hours. But I promise at the end I will leave time for us to chat a little bit. Um, I really do want to thank you all for being here tonight. You might seem like I might seem familiar if you attended the editorial roundtable that TAF hosted a few months ago. Um, and of course, I do work for Writer's Digest, but in my editorial career, I have helped over 100 debut authors achieve Amazon bestseller status. So as you've heard, I've had many, many lives in my editorial career so far. And one of those roles was book coaching. So that is a type of work that puts you very much at the forefront of a writer's emotional life. And I became very familiar in spotting not only the way that doubt and imposter syndrome shows up in obvious ways, but how it can sabotage your career in more insidious ways as well. So I made a list off the top of my head of just a few ways that I have seen doubt start to manifest in a writer's career. So that can be things like not searching outlets to submit to because you don't think your writing is ready or marketable, which is an excuse that I heard a lot. Revising your work over and over, never allowing it to be finished so you can submit it somewhere, not grabbing new opportunities when they arise, avoiding writing ideas that come to you because they might seem too difficult or you don't feel qualified to write them, uh, comparing your work or your career to others, and trying to match what you think a like profitable career looks like, not staying on top of your submissions, offering like freelance rates at a much lower price than the work requires, um, getting extremely angry or upset at small mistakes that you or others make, and sending a bunch of emails in a row to an editor or another professional. And this is just like a taste of the way that this doubt shows up. Um, Unfortunately, I haven't yet cracked the code to fully overcoming imposter syndrome. But through studying and incorporating parts work therapy, which is also called internal family systems, into my writing practice, I can say that you can befriend your imposter syndrome, which I call my doubt demon. And through that work, you can make those voices and that doubt quieter and easier to overcome. Just a caveat that I like to say when I do these discussions, I am not a therapist, nor am I qualified to give any mental health advice. So all of the information I'm going to run through tonight is just through my own study and the use of parts work in my personal life. Um, I'm also going to give us just like the super short and simple version of this psychological practice, but there are a ton of really great resources and books out there if you want to research it more deeply. It's also something for us creative writers. I find it to be a really useful tool when like interrogating my characters, putting them through this system and seeing how their brains work can help you unlock some plot that you didn't see coming. But I digress. Okay. So, parts work therapy is based on the theory that each of us has different aspects of our personality that operate as separate segments. So, I'm sure you've all heard the term inner child. That is a part. The inner child is a part of you that has sort of arrested in childhood and experiences joy and pleasure and all of those things the way that you did when you were that age. Um, but you can have dysfunctional parts that believe they're helping you in some way, but are actually harming you. So, imposter syndrome often stems from a dysfunctional part that is trying to avoid pain, fear, or anxiety. And the way that they do this is they're going to try and say and do whatever they can to keep you from reaching for your goals because they don't want you to get hurt if you fail. So, an example of this can be someone who has a really developed perfectionist part. So, maybe that part of them learned in childhood that they get the most positive attention when they succeed at something. So, now that person won't tolerate anything less than perfection. So, that dysfunctional part will berate that person every time they're less than perfect. And their internal dialogue becomes very poisonous and harsh even when no one externally is treating them that way. So that voice is the voice of the doubt demon. So it'll say things like, you're not good enough, your writing is crap, why do you think you'll ever make money doing this, you have no talent, or whatever it can to keep you feeling small. So the first step is to remember that this part of you isn't setting out to hurt you. Like even anxiety sets out to serve a purpose, right? The way that we can help dismantle the dysfunction is to make that feeling and the part that's bringing it up tangible and familiar. Um, so, for example, I struggle with anxiety and have since I was very young. And now, when I'm feeling that really anxious, like anxious feeling, having very anxious racing thoughts, I envision it as a fox that's been backed into a corner and it can't distinguish a friendly hand from an unfriendly one. So every time I reach for it to try and soothe it, it's going to bite me, right? But it's not evil or cruel, it's just a wild animal. And when I look at my anxiety that way, I can look at it with compassion rather than fear or anger, because I would not look cruelly upon an animal that's just afraid, right? Um, but parts can take all different kinds of forms. So, like, your part might look like an old school marm that's walking up and down rows of school desks and they're staring at your work with a critical eye. Or it could be the feeling of someone standing behind you with their hands on your shoulders. But parts don't have to be literal like people or animals. It could be something like a protective brick wall that stretches as far as the eye can see, or a still lake that shows nothing under the water but darkness, or it can be a tree or a flower. Um, so, super quickly, before we move on, I want to walk us through a visualization exercise. So, like, no one has to share or speak or anything. This is purely just for ourselves. And if it's helpful for visualization, you can go ahead and close your eyes, you can journal, whatever feels good for you. But I want you to think of a time when you experienced fear, anxiety, doubt, or even shame around your writing. Was it a rejection letter? Was it negative feedback from a trusted source? Or even something a teacher once said to you? Once you have that experience in mind, allow the feelings to kind of rise to the surface and ask yourself, like, where in your body do you feel it? What does it feel like? And can you give a face or a structure to that feeling? Can you give it a name? Um, I'm going to give us just 3 minutes of silence while we each kind of connect with that part of ourselves. And then I'll move on to the next part. All right. So I'll let everybody know when we're going to come back to this. Okay, so go ahead and wrap up your final thoughts, and then I'm going to move us on to the next segment. All right. So now that you have a preliminary idea of what that part looks and feels like, it's time to learn how to handle them because they will pop up throughout your career, often in ways you don't expect. And the best way to prepare yourselves for when that pop up is to create a script and practice it. So my script is something like this. Like if I'm really feeling like, um, for example, I was selected for an award honoring women in publishing, and immediately I was like, "Oh God, how could they have picked me? How did they even find me?" Um, and then I had to sit there with that anxiety and be like, "Hey, I see you. I know this is scary. It can feel scary to feel like people are looking at you and reading what you're writing, but we're going to be okay. You know, this isn't the end of the world. I can protect us from anything that might happen. I appreciate you showing up. Thank you. But I don't need you. This is a good thing, and I can do this. It can be as simple as that. So, if you want to, when those moments happen, I always find it helpful to close my eyes and visualize that anxiety. I just take a moment, I close my eyes, I bring that part of myself to the forefront, and I just silently speak to it. Thank you for being here for me. You can step back because I got this. If you're someone who suffers from really intense imposter syndrome, you might find that you'll be delivering this script a lot at first. So it might even be like a few times an hour. Like you're just feeling like it's constantly coming up and you're having to say, please sit back down. I've got this. And it usually that will happen when something has triggered that part of you. But the more you use the script and the more comfortable you get with communicating with that part of you and showing it compassion, the less you'll find it coming up, the less that doubt and those negative thoughts will come up. Because you're going to start proving to that part of you that it doesn't have to protect you, because you can handle yourself and you can take rejection, you can persevere, um, you can find your way forward. And I know this is like a really speedy lesson, but I do think it's an important one. So if it's okay, I thought now we could open the floor if anybody has any questions for me, whether about doubt or the ways that it can show up in your career or really anything. Is that good, Don? Okay, perfect.
I find um I find that I have this thing where I say you could never do that. You
Mm,
could never do that. So sometimes I tell myself that in the case, like I've always said, there's no way I could ever write fiction. I could never do it. I just can't. And I finally, for the last half omnibus, I just started typing on an empty document, no expectations. I
mhm,
didn't even know what I was typing. And eventually I created a short story. But that really opened a door where now I'm working on a romance novel, and I never thought in a million years I could write fiction. But sometimes now I try to pay attention to that one thing I think I could never do that. I can't do
mhm.
that. And I'm like, maybe I can. Is that kind of a form of imposter syndrome? Like just telling yourself, oh, I could never do that?
I think so. I think that a lot of times, especially for those specific, like, oh, I could never do that. I can't imagine myself doing that. Um, those can probably be traced to something that somebody said to you like a long, long time ago that you internalized, and it sounds like it's your voice, but it's actually the memory of that experience. And that part of you is trying to avoid feeling the way that you felt in that moment. So
Okay.
it's telling you that, oh, you couldn't do that. Don't try because you don't want X, Y, and Z to happen. But then you proved it wrong, right? Because you said, well, let's give it a go. And now good things are happening.
Yeah, and it was just one step at a time. Like I'm opening a Microsoft Word document and I'm just going to start typing with no judgment whatsoever.
Well, and I once worked with an author who she had a very interesting relationship with her doubt demon, where anytime that she felt like it was telling her like, oh, you can't do that or you shouldn't do that, or people are going to think you're weird or like whatever it was, she would just do it, just out of spite, really. Where she was like, this works for me to prove to that part of myself that it's wrong. Even if it didn't work out, she was like, well, at least I tried, which is, I think, a very interesting take on that relationship, where instead of like looking at it more with like compassion and trying to befriend it, she was just kind of like, well, screw you. And that worked for her.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I I remember when I first moved up here, and it was about 26 years ago. Uh, and Don actually got me into writing. I was going to go back into IT again because that's where I had come from. And he helped to kind of get me started and everything. But I honestly didn't feel like a writer until about 2 years after I started. I'd had some success and then just a litany of rejections, one after the other. And it got to the point where when I'd get a rejection, I'd go into my files and I'd pull out the stuff that I'd published and read it and say, okay, see, you can do it. So, sometimes I guess that's what it takes.
Yeah, it's always interesting, and sometimes and I have written about this for the WD blog, but like I had a project in my MFA that I was like certain I was going to finish there. And I just kept getting such bad feedback on it. Like anything I wrote, my critique groups would just rip them apart. And I was just so incredibly frustrated. And I was like, I feel like it's going well. Why does everybody hate it? And I had a professor at that time who said to me, like, you're writing this as a 22-year-old, but I think that you need to be writing this as like a 37-year-old.
Mm.
So I just popped it on the shelf. And fairly recently, I took it out and I took a look at it. And I'm like, yeah, I can see what they're saying, the disconnect. Like, I knew what I wanted to say, but I didn't quite know how to say it because I hadn't lived those experiences. And now, as an older person who has lived more life, I'm like, okay, I feel like maybe now this version of me is ready to write these stories. And it's not something I had to, you know, burn and forget and wish that nobody had ever read them. It's just sometimes it's your time and sometimes it's not.
I know I just spoke, but I've run into that with a memoir that I'm writing, and it's already been pitched and said no to by about 36 editors by an agent. And the big problem has been chapter two. It's way too long, but it talks all about my early life. And
Mm.
I hit a wall where it was too painful to look back. I was in denial when people said you need to break into smaller chapters. And I'm like, no, I need all of it. I need all of it. It's all important. I was too attached to it. But recently I was able to pull my manuscript off a shelf and I just literally drew lines through the pages I didn't need. All of a sudden I had the objectivity just to cut all this stuff and it felt great. It felt like cleaning out a closet or something. Um, so
That's a
yeah.
great analogy, Sarah.
I worked with an author who her intention was to write a self-help book about overcoming the sudden loss of a spouse. But the manuscript was almost 200,000 words, and most of it was a memoir, like detailing her meeting her husband, falling in love, their life together, and then his loss. And as an editor, I had to sit with her and be like, this is two books. We need to decide now where we're going because we're either writing a memoir about, your love story, or we are writing a self-help book that will instruct people on how to overcome, this particular grief. And that was a very interesting It ended up being a series of conversations where we looked very, very harshly and critically at her manuscript. But we were able to kind of dissect it into a version of her story that we felt would be most helpful for people to read and to take the self-help aspects away from. So it's often interesting, like the way that in the writing process, like how you said you became very attached to certain things, where she was like, no, people need to understand, like, you know, our meet cute to understand how I felt when I lost him. And I was like, well, you know, in this particular genre, no. So it's often interesting to navigate that, you know, writer attachment when you move into the editorial phase.
And I needed like a year to just put it down. I
Hmm.
really did. But I hope it's not too late. So
Never too late.
I had another thought about a science fiction convention that I went to years and years ago because an author named Alan Dean Foster was there. And I had read a bunch of his books and I really enjoyed them. So at one point, I'm sitting watching a friend of mine's table who sells artwork and stuff. And Alan comes walking along and he strikes up a conversation with me. And my mind is blown because I'm such a fan. And he hops up on the table and he starts chatting. And I said, how did you start and everything? And he was telling me all about this. And he said, but I'm just now feeling like I can actually do it. And that blew my mind because it was like, wait a minute, you've had several books published, but he was just getting to the point where he was like, I'm a writer.
Mhm.
And that was a revelation for me.
I often feel like the armor to like go against your doubt demons is to claim that identity as a writer. Because if you're always telling yourself that you're not a writer, like, oh, I would love to be a writer, or like people often distinguish between a writer and an author. Well, I would really love to be an author, but you know, I just like to write my stories and I don't really think they'll go anywhere. And like that's the language of keeping yourself small. And it's all, I understand very deeply that it's also the language of keeping yourself safe, right? But like making those first tentative steps of even allowing yourself to say in the privacy of your own home, like, I am a writer. This is what I was meant to do, was tell stories. I think that can be very powerful.
I'd like to mention a writer, a science fiction writer named Robert Silverberg. I don't know how many in this group know the name or have read any of his works, but he is a grand master and perhaps one of the greatest science fiction writers of the 20th century. And he got his start in the 50s in the pulps, and he immediately looked at writing as his job. And so he wrote. He said, I'm a writer. This is what I do for a living. This is how I make money. And so he would write whatever needed to be written at that moment in order to make a dollar. He never thought of it beyond that. He knew he was creating art, but he was also a tremendously skilled writer. And he wrote everything. He's known primarily as a science fiction and a fantasy writer, but he wrote literally everything. He wrote erotica, he wrote biographies, he wrote everything across the board. It is like if it's time for the thing was, the trend was books, he wrote novels. The trend was short stories, he wrote short stories. He wrote what needed to be written in that moment because that's what his job was. At the height of his career, Robert Silverberg was publishing more than 1 million words a year, often publishing maybe 3 or 4 novels in a year at the same time. And that's why he is one of my idols, because I aspire to be that kind of a writer. You know what I mean? One who knows what the job entails, knows what the job demands, but has a lot of fun doing it. And also because of that, I don't have the kinds of doubt demons that a lot of people have developed. It's like I know I can do this. I've got this behind me to prove it. And what's next for me? And so that's where I am. I'm always looking at like what's the next step for me as a writer. And so I just wanted to mention that because Richard, he's just such an inspiration and just plowed through whatever doubt demons he might have had, if he had any at all.
Mhm. The pace of publishing I know is slow, but the thought of publishing 3 to 4 books in a year is I know a lot of authors who publish 2 books in a year, and I still can't fathom, like, not just the writing part of it, but all of the promotion, right? All of the marketing, all of the social media, like all of the stuff that comes with a book release. It's a lot. It's a breakneck pace.
And it can be overwhelming,
Yes.
you know.
Does anybody have anything else? It doesn't have to be particularly about this subject. I am open if you have any questions about anything editorial. I'm happy to chat.
And back to something I recently overcame. I had written a poem about um, pumpkin pie that's like put a surprise, and it made it very differently, lower sugar because I'm pre-diabetic, don't want to become diabetic.
Mhm.
And I couldn't get it right. And I had, like belonged to a Thursday night critique group. And even with their critiques, I still couldn't get it. And I just put it away and I'm like, F it. Just stick it away somewhere for a while. And then I remained friends with my younger son's ex-girlfriend. It's a little odd. And she's a marvelous talent. She's not, writing isn't her first thing, but she's a very strong writer.
Hmm.
She has a really good eye for art, both of the written word and visual. So on a whim, I asked if she'd look at it. And I'm glad I did because she gave me the best feedback. She would say, "What your problem is, this is 2 poems in one. You need
Mm.
to pull them out from each part and decide what you want to do." And she talked about that I'm so good with sensory images in my poems to focus on that. And that's all it took. And I rewrote it that day and shared it with the critique group week before last. And it just needed very minor punching up. So it was such a relief to finally, because I really wanted that poem in the book, the
Mhm.
chapbook that I'm doing, and finally got it. It was such a relief. But it's like, when it's always good to have fresh eyes when you're really stumped. If you can find somebody new and fresh that hasn't seen it before, it's amazing what can happen.
You mentioned
Mariah,
that there
And I
was, you mentioned that there were several parts to this presentation. We'll move on to the next part.
Mariah, is there more?
No, so I had the preliminary part and then the exercise,
I see.
then the building of the script.
Okay.
So this is the
Let me ask you, who is your Mariah? You've worn numerous hats
I
over the
have.
course of your career. You said that you've struggled with various aspects, as all writers do, especially at the start. Who is your Robert Silverberg? Who is your inspiration that pushes you forward and says, he did it, I can do this too?
Um, so it's a complicated question, I think, because I was raised by an English teacher, and from a very, very young age, I have like my parents, they were very strict on what I was allowed to watch on TV, what music I was allowed to listen to, but I could read any book I wanted. So like I started reading Stephen King when I was in 4th grade. And so and as part of my editorial job at Writer's Digest, I read everything. And often I'm reading a year before these books are due to hit shelves. Um, so there is no like one person that I'm like, oh, this is my, like, if I could pick anyone's career to kind of, body double or whatever. I don't have one particular person, but I do have a few. So funny enough, when I was in 12th grade, I said to my parents, I want to go to school for writing. I want to be a writer. That's what I want to do. Which sent my poor father into a tailspin, because he's also a teacher. He's a science teacher. And for some reason, his dream had always been that I was going to be the weather girl on Channel 8. So that was, he was like, so you're not gonna like go into meteorology? And I was like, no, that was never something I was ever going to be interested in. But my mom was like, okay, do whatever you want. But my dad said to me, you know, I will help you pay for college. I will let you study whatever you want if you can prove to me that this is going to be like a viable career path. Like, what's your 10-year plan? How are you going to make yourself successful at this? So I took myself to Barnes and Nobles and I went to the research section and I found Writer's Digest books. And there was a particular author who, I mean, I know my background is blurred, but I have my little bookshelf back here. Still, the same books I bought back then. Then when I had a move about a year after I started working at Writer's Digest, and a lot of books that I had had in storage were able to come out of storage. And I'm putting these books on the shelf, and I was like, Robert Brewer wrote all of these books. He is our senior editor at Writer's Digest, and I work with him every day. Um, so Robert was writing things when I was a teenager that led me to working for Writer's Digest and helping people achieve their writing and editorial dreams. So Robert, I think, is one of those people for me, seeing his impact. I mean, he is a poet who one of his poems literally went to the moon. Um, which he doesn't tell this fact to very many people, unfortunately, but there was an astronaut who has this deep love for Robert's work and took one of his poems into space and put it on the moon, and it's still up there. So I would say Robert has had a big impact on me and continues to do so. And the other one I want to mention is Stephen Graham Jones, who is a pretty prolific horror writer, but he has been writing novels since the 90s, and really only stepped into the spotlight when The Only Good Indians came out, which I think was maybe 2016, 2017, I want to say, which to me is like amazing that you can be successful in quiet. You know, you don't have to, be on the news and, be on social media promoting yourself to be a successful writer who is impacting many, many people, who has fans, who he truly is a very talented writer in the horror space. And now I'm glad that so many people know of his work and that he is more in the spotlight. But it is, to me, it's a very encouraging thing to think that you can have a very prolific career and not be a household name, which I think is something that in today's, and we could get into this and we probably won't in this conversation, but I think today's age of social media, like our ideas of success are changing, and people think like, oh, I have to be on covers of magazines and I have to have my name everywhere and I have to have so many book sales to be a quote unquote successful writer, which I don't believe. So he's one of those people for me that, he was writing amazing things before The Only Good Indians, and it just happened to be that's the one that made people more aware of his work.
Moriah, you mentioned earlier people who see a difference between writers and authors.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what a lot of people who may be aspiring writers, but don't, are very new to the game, and those who don't write, have a weird idea of what the profession entails. And they think that, as you said, you have to be Stephen King to be an author. You have to have, books and everybody knows your name. But I think at the end of the day, as I said in 98 Random Thoughts, at the professional level, every writer is equal. And there's no difference between a writer and an author. It's all the same thing. And an author is someone who's on Oprah. A writer is everybody else. And that's not true, and I think the era of the celebrity author is kind of waning too, because so many people are getting into the profession and finding a legitimate degree of success, with their writing, but they're not famous. I consider myself as a successful writer. Nobody knows me. Nobody knows my name. I'm not famous in any particular way, but I've made my living with words for 48 years. And I think there's a lot of people out there like that. And a lot of people within this organization who are like that too, who write regularly and this is their job, but nobody knows their name. And I think that it's dangerous to think that there's a difference between authors and writers. Author is just a fancy name for people who put words on paper.
Well, and it is interesting because I have known authors who are not writers. And you're like, how can that be? And it's because like they may be good at writing, but it doesn't fuel them. They don't find the joy in it or the drive in it the way that like when I think of writers, like if you're a true writer, you have to write. Right? Like even if it's a journal, even if you're just dashing off poetry as it's coming to you, you might have drawers and drawers of things that you never think anybody will read because you don't necessarily want them to read it. But it's that innate drive to get those stories out, that creative part of you that's always churning. And maybe it takes breaks and it has seasons where it's more active and it's less active. But you can be an author and pen one book and be like, that's enough of that, and go do something else. And you're not a writer.
I am so happy you said that, Moriah. I am so happy that you said that. It's just absolutely true. You know what I mean? It really is. And I think that I've come from that experience as well. I'd really be curious to find out how many people in this group, by a show of hands, don't who are afflicted by some kind of issue that is keeping them from finding the success that they may seek. You know what I mean? I've wanted to do this since I was in middle school. And as you said, I am driven, literally driven to write. I have to. It consumes me. I think about it all day long, and that's not an exaggeration. I might have an illness going on here because I can't speak about it. It's literally my life. But as you said, there's a lot of people who might publish a book and it was like, okay, all right, I did that. That's not me. And thank God I found the success that I did, because I'm literally incapable of doing anything else. That's absolutely true. I don't know what I would be doing if I hadn't made it as a writer. I can't do it.
Well, I was going to ask a question. I know we talked a little bit about accepting feedback. I know you said you had something on the shelf that, one day you just picked up and you were ready to work on again. I know I had talked about hitting a wall with my memoir where I was like, I just can't figure this out. And it wasn't that I couldn't figure it out. It was too overwhelming and I felt like I already failed, right? And do you have any specific feedback for when you receive feedback and you feel like giving up or being overwhelmed?
Yeah, so that is something that I struggle with because, and again, this is a whole different conversation, but I actually found that my MFA program was a double-edged sword in that it was like a pressure cooker. I came out a completely different writer than I went in, a much better writer, like much more technically sound. I knew what my voice was, but at the same time, being in that kind of workshop setting was detrimental to the emotional aspect of writing, where I would sit down and just automatically hear all of that feedback and not be able to write anything. So I think the first step is finding people whose feedback matches your goals for the piece. So for example, I'm currently working with an author who she's writing something very experimental. It's something that I hate the word, but in publishing, something is either marketable or it's not. which we usually take to mean, you know, that a traditional publisher is going to be very reluctant to pick it up. And she and I talked about like, what is her goal for this piece? And she said, I just want to be done with it. I just want to be able to get it out there. I want to hand it off to friends and family, and I want to move on to the next thing. So we decided that, you know, based on her goals and her vision for the project, that is how I'm going to approach feedback to that work. You know, I'm not going to judge it in the same way that I would judge a piece of work for somebody whose goal is to get it traditionally published, to have it in all the airport bookshops, you know, to be on Oprah or, you know, whatever that big hope is. So I think the first step is truly finding people to give you the type of feedback that you're looking for to make your goal for that project successful. The second half of that is going to be the internal work you'll have to do when receiving any type of feedback moving forward. Because unfortunately for some of us, I know this is true of myself, and it might not be true for you. I don't know. But once you have that kind of voice in your head, it's very difficult to like, you're like, okay, you know, I've found somebody whose feedback I trust. I really, you know, I see where we're going with this, but still that voice is going to come up and it's going to make it very difficult for you. It almost feels like you're walking around without your skin on sometimes, where like you are just so sensitive to any kind of perceived rejection or judgment. So the hard part is going to be learning how to work with that feeling instead of allowing it to control you. Which I'm more than happy to email about that. I'll drop my email in there because that's a larger conversation that I
Sure.
don't want to I don't
Yeah.
make you have here in this format. So let me. But yeah, I'm happy to talk about that more like emotional, personal aspect of that and how you can navigate that.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Does anyone else have any questions for Moriah or any comments about what we've talked about this evening?
I have a quick question. Hi, everybody. I wanted to know how you know when it's not a good fit with a particular editor outside of, oh, they hurt my feelings, they didn't like my work. But if it's a matter of them it being a good relationship or them getting what you're trying to do versus, oh, you should change this, people aren't going to like that. Like, how do you know when it's a good fit versus when this isn't the editor for you?
That is a really good question, and I hope I'm able to give you a nuanced answer here. So a lot of it is going to be what I feel like is instinctual. Like if somebody's just giving you a vibe where you're like, no, they don't really seem to get what I'm doing here. You know, I always say you can trust that instinct. If you're still learning how to like respond to that instinct, if it doesn't seem like that feeling is really evident for you, um, something that might be helpful is to write a list of things that you know about the work that are integral to the work that cannot change. Um, so, for example, like if you have a particular theme that you really want to get across, and the editor is like, "Oh, that's not what you're saying here," and you're like, "Well, I am." You know, it might be something like that. It sometimes is something more overt. So for example, I once worked with an editor who I write a lot of like very strange fiction. Like, you know, I mean it in a good way. I'm a speculative fiction writer, so some things that I write are like highly metaphorical or very strange. And I often incorporate a lot of soft world building because the magical aspects are meant to be metaphors. So I had an editor who was like, "You need to rip all the magic out and like make this it was a story that was exploring how depression like steals your emotions from you. And in the story, a young girl was turned into a puppet, like a living puppet with no emotions. And they were like, oh, this is not that. You should make her just a little girl who gets kidnapped by an older man. And I was like, that is not at all what I'm doing here. So I was immediately like, this is not a good fit because you are not the kind of person who understands, soft world building, highly metaphorical works, or is interested in learning how to edit such a manuscript. So I think a lot of it is you learning where the line is for yourself. Like if somebody's really like, oh, I think you need to, cut this character, or, I think this is something I have learned. For your editors, the first thing you might want to ask them after they read your work, what do you think this story is about? Like what do you think is the theme here? What do you think, I'm saying with this piece? That can often be a really good indicator of whether or not they are aligned with your vision. Because if they say something that's just like so totally off base, you're like, okay, maybe it's not a good fit. Because I know even if I'm looking at something that hasn't been successful, I can generally say, like, okay, I see what you're trying to do here, and I'm going to help you get there. It's just not there yet. But if I'm like, I have no idea what you're doing here, then I'm probably not a good fit. So I know that was like a lot of kind of rambling all over the place. I hope I have given you some helpful
No, that
information.
was good. That was good. I appreciate that answer. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah,
I'm going to
absolutely.
read super quick, Moriah, a comment that Christy Stevenson just made a moment ago. She said, screenwriter, producer, director Drew Goddard gave me the greatest gift and very unexpectedly. I was lucky enough to meet him in person, and my husband pressed me to take the opportunity to talk to him about craft. He was very kind, forthcoming, encouraging, and beyond accommodating. I left on a high with a feeling of accomplishment and renewed vigor for writing. The experience was the opposite of a demon for me. And I think that is just awesome. And that is like, she's right. That is a terrific gift that a lot of writers don't get. And I hope that happens to every writer. Mark and I had a similar experience at a convention in Louisville with horror director George Romero, who made Night of the Living Dead. We met him in the bar, and it was just the three of us talking about craft and writing for 20 minutes, just him and Mark and myself. And it was the same kind of thing. We came away from that experience just enthused and so excited and really, really motivated. It was just a simple conversation over coffee, but with a man tremendously, tremendously experienced. And that's why I encourage everybody to attend conferences when they can, because that's, and as I say, as I tell people, you learn the most and you hear the best stories at the bar. That's where the stuff happens. Does anyone else have anything to share, or any other questions for Moriah while we have her? Moriah, I can't thank you enough. This was absolutely wonderful, and we appreciate it tremendously.
Yeah,
This was great
absolutely.
fun.
Thank
I
you so
love the
much for having me
conversation
back.
it inspired.